In 1769, a child was born on an island so remote that France had only owned it for 1 year. He would die in exile on another island, at the far edge of the world, with nothing left but a name. Between those two islands, he fought more than 60 battles. He rewrote the legal foundation of an entire civilization. He toppled dynasties that had stood for centuries. He came closer to unifying Europe by force than anyone before him, and anyone after him for more than 100 years. He is one of the most searched and mythologized figures in European history. And almost everything you think you know about him begins with a story someone else constructed, either to glorify him or to condemn him, and in both cases, to use him. This is not a biography of a hero. It is not a biography of a monster. It is the story of what happens when one man's intelligence, ambition, an absolute refusal to accept limits collides with the limits that reality always, eventually, impose. The question we will carry through every chapter of this documentary is not whether Napoleon was good or evil. That question is too small for what he actually was. The real question is this: how does the same man who genuinely liberated nations end up destroying them? And what does the answer tell us about power itself? Not just in his time, but in ours. We begin not in Paris, not on a battlefield. We begin on a small Mediterranean island, in a house that smelled of olive wood and sea air, with a boy who did not yet speak French and already felt the world owed him something it had not yet delivered. Chapter 1: The Island and the Outsider. To understand Napoleon Bonaparte, you have to first understand what it feels like to belong to a place that belongs to someone else. Corsica, in 1769, was not French in any meaningful sense. It had been Genoese for centuries. A rugged Mediterranean island of mountain villages, clan loyalties, and a culture closer to the Italian mainland than to anything across the water to the northwest. Then, in 1768, Genoa transferred its rights over the island to France, under financial and political pressure. The transaction was purely administrative. Nobody asked the Corsicans. And yet, the most honest way to describe what happened is the simplest one. France owned Corsica because Genoa needed money. That was the foundation on which Napoleon Bonaparte's world was built. The following year, on the 15th of August, 1769, Carlo Bonaparte and his wife Letizia had their second surviving child. They named him Napoleon. The name was Italian. The family was Italian in language, in custom, in identity. The island was now technically French. The child growing up in it would spend the first decade of his life navigating the gap between those two facts. This detail matters more than most biographies admit. Napoleon did not grow up French. He grew up Corsican, which in the late 18th century meant growing up with a specific kind of political consciousness that mainland Europeans rarely developed. He understood from childhood that national identity was not natural. It was imposed. Borders were drawn by people with power, not by culture or consent. For a child paying attention, that is a remarkable first lesson about how the world actually works. His father Carlo was a lawyer of modest, noble status, intelligent and ambitious, but operating in a system that offered limited room for advancement. His mother Letizia was something more formidable. Contemporary accounts and later testimony from Napoleon himself consistently describe her as a woman of iron discipline and almost complete emotional self-containment. She managed a large family on limited resources with an efficiency that left no room for sentiment. Napoleon would later say, in one of his more revealing moments of self-reflection, that his mother's character explained everything about his own. The Bonaparte family claimed noble lineage, which in Corsica meant something different than it did in Paris. There was no great estate, no accumulated wealth, no network of aristocratic connections. There was a name, a claim, and the social expectation that came with it. Carlo worked tirelessly to have the family's noble status recognized by French authorities, because French recognition opened doors that Corsican recognition alone could not. He succeeded, eventually, and that success would make the next step possible. In 1778, Napoleon was 9 years old when his father enrolled him in a French school on the mainland. The decision was practical. Carlo had secured a scholarship. The French military and administrative systems offered real opportunities for a boy of noble status, even minor noble status. And those opportunities required a French education. What the decision did not account for was what it would cost the boy to get there. Napoleon arrived at the school in Autun, speaking almost no French. He spoke Corsican Italian. He was small for his age, dark, and from a place that educated Frenchmen regarded with a mixture of condescension and indifference. Within months, he was transferred to the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château, where he would spend the next 5 years. Brienne was not cruel in any exceptional way. It was simply a French institution of the 1780s, which meant it operated on a clear hierarchy of social status, regional origin, and family wealth. Napoleon had none of the credentials that hierarchy rewarded. He was poor by the standards of his classmates. He was foreign by accent and manner. He was Corsican, which to French aristocratic boys was roughly equivalent to being from nowhere. The historical record from this period, drawn primarily from the memoirs of classmates and the accounts collected by later biographers, including Louis-Antoine Fauvelet de Bourrienne, who was actually present at Brienne, describes a boy who responded to social exclusion in a specific and consistent way. He did not try to fit in. He withdrew into the one domain where social connections did not matter and individual capability was everything: mathematics. Napoleon at Brienne was, by multiple accounts, an unremarkable student in most subjects. His French remained accented and grammatically imperfect for years. He was indifferent to the classical curriculum, but in mathematics, and in the military application of mathematics, particularly artillery, he was exceptional, not because he had some mysterious gift, but because he worked at it with a focus that his classmates, more comfortable in their social world, did not apply. Andrew Roberts, in his biography, Napoleon: A Life, published in 2014, which draws on over 600 letters Napoleon wrote that had not been fully analyzed in previous biographies, describes this period as the foundation of the specific mental habit that would define his military genius. The ability to reduce a complex situation to its essential variables, calculate the probable outcomes, and act on that calculation faster than the situation could change. It was not intuition. It was applied mathematics made automatic through years of deliberate practice. But there is something else worth understanding about those years at Brienne that the mathematical narrative tends to obscure. Napoleon was not simply studying artillery. He was also, simultaneously, developing an identity in the absence of one. He could not be French, because the French boys around him made clear every day that he was not. He was increasingly detached from Corsica, because the education he was receiving was pulling him into a world his island could not provide. He was in the most literal sense. A person between two places, belonging fully to neither. What fills that kind of vacuum? In a person of high intelligence and high ambition is often a self-constructed identity, more powerful than any inherited one. Napoleon did not find his people at Brienne. He found something more dangerous. He found himself, or at least the first draft of the person he intended to become. He graduated from Brienne in 1784 and transferred to the École Militaire in Paris, the most prestigious military academy in France. He completed in 1 year a program designed for 2, driven by financial pressure after his father's death, left the family in difficult circumstances, and by an impatience that would never fully leave him. He graduated as a second lieutenant of artillery in September of 1785. At 16 years old, the examiner's report noted his ability in mathematics. It did not note his ambition, because ambition does not show up in examination reports. It shows up later, in what a person does with what they know. Napoleon returned to Corsica several times in the years immediately following his graduation, still emotionally connected to the island, still writing to his early mentor, the Corsican independence leader, Pasquale Paoli, in terms that suggest genuine nationalist feeling. As late as 1789, when the French Revolution began to reshape the political landscape of everything Napoleon had grown up in, his first instinct was not to think about France. It was to think about what the revolution might mean for Corsica. This is the detail that matters most about the early Napoleon, and the one that most popular accounts skip too quickly past. He did not start out wanting to conquer Europe. He started out wanting to matter on an island that had already been conquered by someone else. The scope of his ambition expanded gradually, in direct proportion to his understanding of what was actually possible. And that understanding was shaped by every humiliation at Brienne, every calculation at the École Militaire, and every political lesson absorbed from growing up in a place where sovereignty was a transaction rather than a birthright. By 1793, he had been forced to flee Corsica permanently. After a bitter political conflict with Paoli's faction left the Bonaparte family without safety or allies on the island, he arrived in France not as a Frenchman coming home. He arrived as a man who had lost his first country and now had only one direction left to go: forward. The revolution that was consuming France when he arrived was not his revolution. He had not stormed the Bastille. He had not written pamphlets about liberty. He had been on an island, thinking about a completely different set of political problems. But the revolution had done something for him that no amount of planning could have arranged. It had destroyed the old system of advancement. In the French army of 1788, a boy from a minor Corsican noble family with a foreign accent and no connections had a ceiling above him that no amount of talent could break. The aristocratic officer class controlled promotion, and they controlled it in favor of their own kind. Then the revolution came, and the aristocratic officer class fled, was imprisoned, or was executed. The ceiling disappeared. What replaced it was the one thing Napoleon had been quietly accumulating since Brienne: demonstrated capability. He was 23 years old, stationed in the south of France, commanding artillery that most of his superiors did not fully understand, when a small port city gave him the opportunity to show what he could do with it. The city was Toulon. The year was 1793. And what happened there would introduce Napoleon Bonaparte to the world, and, more importantly, would introduce Napoleon Bonaparte to his own potential. But before we follow him to Toulon, sit with the young man standing at the edge of that moment. He is 23. He has no country, in any emotional sense. He has no wealth. He has no powerful friends. He has a mind that has been sharpened by years of deliberate practice on problems that most people found too difficult to bother with, and an identity that was forged not by belonging, but by exclusion. He is, in every conventional sense, an outsider, and he is about to discover that in a world where the old rules have just been burned down, being an outsider is not a disadvantage. It is the only qualification that matters. Chapter 2. The School That Made a Weapon. Picture a winter morning at Brienne. Sometime around 1782, the other boys are inside, warming themselves near the fire, moving through the social rituals that fill the hours between lessons. Napoleon is in the garden. He has claimed a patch of frozen ground near the back wall, away from the main courtyard where the older boys congregate. The air is cold enough that his breath comes out in small clouds. He does not appear to notice. He has spent the past hour organizing a group of younger boys into 2 teams, assigning each one a specific position, explaining with a patience he rarely shows in the classroom exactly what he expects each person to do and why. The snow fortification he is building is not a casual thing. The walls are a specific height. The angles of defense have been thought about. The boys he has stationed as attackers have been given a route that he has already determined will fail if the defenders hold their positions correctly. Louis-Antoine Fauvelet de Bourrienne, his classmate and later his secretary, recorded this scene in his memoirs with the specific detail of someone who had been there and who understood, looking back, that he had witnessed something worth noting. Not because a child building a snow fort is remarkable, because of the quality of attention the child brought to it, because of the way he moved between the positions, checking each one, correcting a boy who had drifted from his assigned spot, entirely absorbed in the system he was testing. The other boys found it slightly strange. Bourrienne found it, in retrospect, clarifying. That quality of attention is what Brienne actually produced in Napoleon Bonaparte. And understanding what shaped it requires understanding what military education in 18th century France was actually teaching, and what it accidentally taught to a boy who had already learned that the social world was not going to reward him through conventional means. The French Royal Military Schools of the 1770s and 1780s were institutions in transition, the old aristocratic model of officer formation, in which birth-determined rank and tactical thinking was considered less important than social grace, was already showing its age. The 7 Years' War, which had ended in 1763 and had been a significant humiliation for French arms, had produced a generation of reformers within the French military who understood that the next war would be won or lost on the quality of artillery, on the speed of troop movement, and on the tactical intelligence of officers in the field rather than on the elegance of their family trees. The most important of these reformers, for our purposes, was Jean-Baptiste Vaquet de Gribeauval, who reorganized the French artillery system in the 1760s and 1770s into what became known as the Gribeauval system. He standardized cannon weights, improved carriage designs, increased mobility, and created a doctrine that emphasized the use of concentrated artillery fire to break enemy formations before infantry advanced. The system was not yet fully implemented when Napoleon was a student, but its principles were already being taught, and they fell on Napoleon's mind like rain on dry ground. Artillery in the 18th century was the one branch of military service where mathematics was not optional. A cavalry officer could succeed on courage and horsemanship, An infantry officer needed discipline and presence, but an artillery officer who could not calculate trajectories, account for powder charge variations, estimate distances under pressure, and place his guns to maximize their effect on a specific piece of terrain was simply a man standing next to an expensive and dangerous piece of metal. Napoleon understood this. More importantly, he understood that artillery was the branch where a man without social connections could distinguish himself purely through technical competence. The cannon did not care about his accent. The mathematics did not care about his family's income. The trajectory of a 12-pound ball followed the same laws of physics regardless of whether the man who calculated it was from Paris or from Corsica. His focus at Brienne on mathematics was therefore not simply intellectual preference. It was strategic. He was identifying, with a clarity unusual in a boy of 10 or 11, the specific domain where the rules of the social game he was losing did not apply. Bourrienne describes Napoleon as almost entirely indifferent to the social life of the school. He did not pursue friendships with the boys whose families had the connections that would later matter for advancement. He did not participate in the social rituals that built the networks most of his classmates were already constructing for their futures. He read, he calculated, he thought about terrain and position, and the movement of forces in ways that his teachers recognized as exceptional and his classmates found slightly strange. When you cannot win the social game, you invent a different game with different rules, and you make yourself the best player in it. This is not a uniquely Napoleonic insight. It is a pattern visible in the early lives of many people who later changed the world. Usually, people who experienced significant exclusion in formative years and responded not with defeat, but with a kind of cold, focused reinvention. The École Militaire in Paris, where Napoleon transferred in 1784, added a different layer to what he was becoming. Paris itself was the first major city Napoleon had ever encountered, and the contrast with everything he had known before was sharp enough to be educational in its own right. The scale of it, the density of human ambition, concentrated in one place. The visible machinery of a system where enormous power was held by a relatively small number of people. All of this registered on a mind that had already been primed to think about how systems worked and who benefited from them. At the École Militaire he encountered, for the first time, genuinely sophisticated instruction in the theoretical dimensions of military science. He read widely in the military literature available to him, including the works of Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose campaigns Napoleon studied with the specific attention of someone taking notes for later use rather than completing an academic exercise. Frederick's emphasis on speed of movement, concentration of force at the decisive point, and the psychological dimension of warfare, as much as the physical one, left visible marks on the tactical thinking Napoleon would later develop. He graduated in September of 1785. The overall assessment placed him 42nd out of 58 graduates, a ranking that reflects both his compressed timeline and the limits of his performance in subjects that did not hold his interest. 42nd out of 58. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment, because it is the kind of detail that the heroic version of the Napoleon story tends to skip past. He was not the top of his class. He was not the obvious future conqueror of Europe. He was a middle-ranked graduate of a military academy, 16 years old, commissioned as a second lieutenant of artillery, with no particular reason for anyone watching to believe he was anything other than what he appeared to be. What he was, underneath the unremarkable surface of that ranking, was a person who had spent 7 years in institutions that were supposed to form him into a certain kind of officer, and had instead formed him into something the institutions had not intended and could not have predicted. He had internalized the technical knowledge of artillery with a depth that most of his contemporaries had not bothered to develop. He had read military history and theory with the focus of someone who intended to use it rather than simply know it. He had learned, through years of social exclusion, to operate entirely on internal motivation rather than external validation. He had developed, through the specific experience of being an outsider in every room he entered, an observer's detachment from the social performance that consumed most of the energy of most people around him. And he had developed something harder to name, but equally important: a settled, almost serene conviction that the gap between where he was and where he intended to be was a problem of time and opportunity rather than a permanent condition. The boy in the garden at Brienne, checking the angles of his snow fortification with the seriousness of someone who actually intended to defend it, had become a 16-year-old officer with a commission and a direction and a hunger that no rank on a graduation list could measure. The question was where the opportunity would come from. In 1785, that question had no obvious answer. He was a second lieutenant in the artillery, stationed in Valence, in the Dauphine region of southeastern France. He wrote, he sent money home to his family in Corsica. He was, by every external measure, going nowhere in particular. 4 years later, a Paris crowd stormed a prison, and the world he had been trained to serve began to come apart at the foundations. He would not mourn it. He would use it. Chapter 3. Revolution as Opportunity. On the 14th of July, 1789, a crowd in Paris stormed the Bastille fortress and released its 7 prisoners. The event was more symbolic than strategic. The Bastille held almost no one, and its military significance was minimal. But symbols, as Napoleon would later demonstrate better than almost anyone in history, can be more powerful than armies. The French Revolution had begun, and Napoleon Bonaparte, 20 years old and stationed in provincial France, understood almost immediately that what was beginning was not primarily a political event. It was a vacancy, an enormous, dangerous, world historical vacancy in the structure of French power. And vacancies, for a person paying attention, are opportunities. To understand why Napoleon responded to the revolution the way he did, you have to first understand what the revolution actually destroyed that mattered most to his personal situation. The French army of 1788 had a ceiling, not a formal ceiling, not a written rule, but a ceiling as real and solid as any law. The highest ranks of the officer corps were reserved, by custom and by the Ségur Ordinance of 1781, for men who could demonstrate 4 generations of noble ancestry. A talented officer from a minor provincial family, regardless of his ability, could expect to rise to a certain level and then stop. The system was not designed to find the best military minds in France. It was designed to keep the existing social order in uniform. The revolution dissolved that system with a speed that was almost violent. The aristocratic officer corps, which had provided the senior leadership of the French military for generations, largely ceased to exist within a few years. Some officers fled France as émigrés. Some were imprisoned during the Terror. Some were executed. The army that remained needed leaders, and it needed them immediately. And it could no longer afford to care about 4 generations of noble ancestry when enemy armies were massing on multiple frontiers. Napoleon watched this happen with the specific attention of someone who had been waiting, without quite knowing he was waiting, for exactly this kind of disruption. His response to the revolution in its early years was not ideological. This is a point that historians, including David Bell, in his work on Napoleon, published in 2015, and Sudhir Hazarisingh, in his examination of the Napoleon myth, published in 2014, both emphasize. And it is a point worth dwelling on because it separates Napoleon from many of the people around him who were genuinely transformed by revolutionary ideology. He was not a true believer. He did not burn with the conviction that liberty, equality, and fraternity were sacred principles for which any sacrifice was justified. He was something more complicated and more dangerous. He was a person who understood that the revolution had changed the rules of the game he was playing, and who adapted to the new rules faster and more completely than almost anyone else. He attended Jacobin club meetings in the early years of the revolution, not because Jacobin ideology resonated with him deeply, but because that was where the political energy was, and being near political energy was better than being away from it. He maintained enough ideological flexibility to align himself with whatever faction held power without ever becoming so identified with any single faction that its fall would take him down with it. This flexibility was not cynicism in the simple sense. Napoleon genuinely believed in some of the revolution's practical achievements, particularly its assault on the rigid social hierarchies that had limited his own advancement. He believed in careers open to talent, in the idea that a man should rise as far as his ability could carry him, rather than stopping at a ceiling built by birth. He believed this because he had lived the alternative and found it intolerable. But his belief in revolutionary principle was always subordinate to his belief in his own trajectory. When the two came into conflict, there was never any doubt which would win. The first major test of what he was becoming came not in France but in Corsica, and it ended in a way that clarified everything. In the early years of the revolution, Napoleon made several extended trips back to Corsica, still believing at some level that his future might be there. He involved himself in Corsican politics, aligning himself with different factions as they rose and fell, trying to build a local power base. He sought a position in the Corsican National Guard. His political maneuvering in Corsica eventually put him on the wrong side of Pasquale Paoli, the dominant figure in Corsican politics, the man Napoleon had once admired as a hero of Corsican independence. Paoli turned against the Bonaparte family with the thoroughness of a man who had been disappointed by people he had trusted. In June of 1793, the Bonaparte family fled Corsica permanently, essentially as refugees, their house reportedly sacked by Paoli's supporters. Napoleon arrived in France with nothing. No island, no political base, no fallback position. The door to his first country had closed behind him. What followed next, within months, was Toulon, the city of Toulon, on the Mediterranean coast of southern France, had surrendered to a British and Spanish fleet in August of 1793. The counter-revolutionary forces holding the city were supplied and supported from the sea, making a conventional land assault extremely difficult. The Republican army besieging Toulon was disorganized, poorly led, and making essentially no progress. The commander of artillery for the siege was wounded, and a replacement was needed. Napoleon was 23 years old when he arrived at Toulon to take the artillery command. He was a captain. He was unknown outside his immediate circle. By every conventional measure, he was a junior officer in a chaotic military situation that more senior and more experienced men had already failed to resolve. What he saw when he arrived was not what his predecessors had seen. Where previous commanders had looked at Toulon as a city to be assaulted, Napoleon looked at it as a geometry problem. The British fleet in the harbor was the key. The fleet could not stay in the harbor if the heights overlooking it were held by artillery capable of making the anchorage untenable. The heights were called Les Guillettes. Take Les Guillettes. Place the guns there correctly, and the fleet would have to leave. If the fleet left, the city's defenders lost their supply line and their escape route simultaneously. The city would fall without a direct assault. He proposed this analysis to his superiors. They were skeptical. He persisted. With a combination of technical argument and sheer force of personality that would become one of his most consistent characteristics, he got enough authorization to begin positioning guns on the heights. He supervised the construction of gun emplacements himself, working alongside the soldiers rather than directing from a distance. He was wounded in the thigh during the fighting around the heights. A detail that matters because it tells you something about how close to the action he was operating. The British fleet left the harbor on the 19th of December, 1793. Toulon fell within days. The officer who had conceived and executed the artillery plan that decided the siege was immediately promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old. Toulon did several things for Napoleon simultaneously. It gave him his first major military success. It demonstrated that his analysis of artillery and tactical geometry was not theoretical competence, but practical genius. And it connected him, at least temporarily, to the Jacobin political network centered on the Robespierre brothers. In July of 1794, Maximilien Robespierre was arrested and executed in the event known as the Thermidorian Reaction, which ended the most radical phase of the revolution. Napoleon, because of his association with Augustin Robespierre, was briefly arrested himself. He was held for about 2 weeks and then released. The investigation, finding insufficient evidence of counter-revolutionary activity, 2 weeks of imprisonment, then release. Then the question of what came next. What came next was an opportunity that arrived from the most unlikely direction. A political crisis in Paris, an angry crowd, and a man who needed someone who could use artillery in a city street. In October of 1795, royalist sections of Paris rose in revolt against the National Convention. The politician Paul Barras, who would later become one of the 5 directors governing France, recommended Napoleon, whom he had met at Toulon. Napoleon received the command. He positioned his artillery at the key approaches to the Tuileries, where the convention was meeting. When the royalist crowd advanced, he used concentrated fire to disperse them. The death toll from this engagement is uncertain, with estimates in the historical record varying considerably depending on the source and its political sympathies. And the honest position is that the precise figure cannot be established. What is not disputed is that the engagement was brief, that it was decisive, and that it ended the royalist threat to the convention within hours. Napoleon was promoted to commander of the Army of the Interior. He was 26 years old. He had gone from unemployed in the summer of 1795 to the most powerful military figure in the French capital by October of the same year. The politician who recommended him, Barras, also introduced him to a woman named Josephine de Beauharnais. She was a widow, 6 years older than Napoleon, born in Martinique, the daughter of a plantation-owning family, and possessed of a grace and social fluency that Napoleon, for all his military intelligence, found genuinely disorienting. She had survived the terror by the narrowest margin. her first husband having been guillotined while she waited in a cell for a fate that never arrived. She had emerged from that experience with the specific quality of someone who has looked at the worst the world can offer and decided to live as fully as possible in whatever time remains. Napoleon fell for her with an intensity that surprised people who knew him, because it was the one domain in his life where his usual calculations seemed to fail him entirely. He wrote her letters from his military postings that are among the most nakedly emotional documents he ever produced. Letters in which the controlled intelligence that governed everything else he did is entirely absent, replaced by something rawer and more vulnerable. Josephine did not love him the same way. This was known to people around them and suspected by Napoleon himself, though he refused for years to fully accept what the evidence was telling him. The marriage was real, and its consequences were enormous, but its emotional terms were never equal, and that inequality would haunt the relationship until its end. They married in March of 1796. Within days of the wedding, Napoleon left for Italy. He had been given command of the Army of Italy, an assignment that most observers of the French military situation considered a secondary posting at best. The Army of Italy was undersupplied, underpaid, and had accomplished little in the previous campaigns against the Austrian and Piedmontese forces defending the Alpine passes. What those observers did not know was that he had been thinking about the Italian campaign for years. He had studied the terrain. He had read every account of previous military operations in the region he could find. He had developed, in the abstract, a theory of how the campaign could be won that had nothing to do with the way it had been attempted before. He was 26 years old. He was newly married to a woman who did not love him the way he loved her. He was commanding an army that did not yet know what it had in him. He was about to find out himself. Chapter 4. Italy and the Birth of the Legend. On a road somewhere in the Ligurian Alps, in the first week of April 1796, a French soldier named Jean, who had not been paid in 3 months and whose boots had worn through at the soles, looked up at the new general who had just ridden past and tried to decide what to make of him. The general was small. He was younger than most of the colonels. He rode past the column without the ceremonial distance that senior officers usually maintained, close enough that Jean could see his face clearly. I could see that the general was not looking at him or at any individual soldier, but at something further ahead. Some configuration of ground and possibility that the column of exhausted men apparently did not obstruct. Jean had served under commanders who performed authority with considerable skill, who held themselves at the correct distance, who spoke in the correct register, who made you aware at every moment that rank separated you from them in ways that went beyond the uniform. This general did not perform authority. He simply had it, in the specific way that a man has it when he is genuinely indifferent to whether you find him impressive, because he is already thinking about something else. Jean would march with this general from the Alps to Milan and back again over the following year. He would fight at Montenat and Lodi and Rivoli. He would eat better than he had eaten in 2 years of service, because the general had a gift for moving his army through territory in ways that put food within reach. He would be paid, eventually, in coin that actually had value. He would send a letter home to his family in Lyon describing the general in terms that his family reportedly found difficult to believe. He would survive the Italian campaign. He would not survive Russia. But in April of 1796, on a road in the Alps, he was simply a tired soldier trying to assess a new commander. And what he felt, before the reasoning that came later, was something simpler and harder to articulate, that this one was different. The Army of Italy that Napoleon took command of in March of 1796 was by the accounts of everyone who observed it before his arrival. A force in serious institutional decline. The soldiers were hungry. Their equipment was worn. Their morale had been ground down by a succession of commanders who had achieved little against the Austrian and Piedmontese forces holding the Alpine passes. The army had approximately 37,000 men on paper, and considerably fewer who were actually fit for combat. Napoleon's first address to his troops has been quoted so many times that it has acquired the slightly polished quality of something that has been handled by too many hands. But the core of what he told them was simple enough to have been genuinely said, and genuinely felt. He told them that fertile plains waited on the other side of the mountains, that what they lacked, the plains would provide, that glory was waiting for them, and that he was going to lead them there. It was a promise dressed in the language of destiny, and it worked. Not because the soldiers were naive, but because Napoleon believed it himself with a completeness that communicated through everything about him. The campaign that followed, between April and November of 1796, is still studied in military academies for the same reason that chess players study certain games. Not because it was the largest or most destructive campaign in history, but because it demonstrates with unusual clarity what a mind operating at its highest capacity can do with limited resources against opponents who have more of almost everything except speed of thought. The strategic situation Napoleon inherited was a stalemate. The Austrian and Piedmontese forces held the mountain passes and had the advantage of interior lines, meaning they could shift forces between their positions faster than a force attacking from outside could move. The conventional military solution was to concentrate force and attempt to break through a single strong point, accepting high casualties for a potentially decisive breakthrough. Napoleon's solution came from a principle he had been developing since his reading of Frederick the Great's campaigns and his observation of artillery dynamics at Toulon. He did not want to break through the enemy line at its strongest point. He wanted to split it at its weakest point. Move faster than the two separated halves could communicate with each other. Defeat each half separately before they could reunite. And repeat the process with whatever new configuration of enemy forces emerged. In the first 2 weeks of the Italian campaign, Napoleon defeated the Piedmontese and Austrian forces in a sequence of engagements at Montenot, Millesimo, Dego, and Mondovi that forced Piedmont to seek an armistice within days. He had separated the two allied armies, defeated each in detail, and secured his southern flank in less than a fortnight. Military historians, including the scholar David Chandler, whose analysis of Napoleonic campaigns remains one of the most thorough available, describe this opening sequence as a near-perfect execution of the principle of dividing and destroying a numerically superior force. He then crossed the Po River, outflanking the Austrian defensive line, and drove into the Lombard Plain. The Austrian commander found himself repeatedly in the position of preparing a defense that Napoleon had already made irrelevant by moving somewhere unexpected. The speed of the French advance was the key. Napoleon pushed his army at a pace that his opponents, operating on the slower rhythms of 18th century military convention, simply could not match. By May of 1796, he was in Milan. The campaign lasted until the following year and involved a series of additional engagements, most notably the sustained fighting around Mantua, where an Austrian fortress held out for months while Napoleon defeated multiple Austrian relief armies attempting to break the siege. The Battle of Rivoli, in January of 1797, in which Napoleon defeated a significantly larger Austrian force attempting to relieve Mantua, is considered by military historians to be among the finest tactical performances of his career. By the time the campaign concluded with the Treaty of Campo Formio in October of 1797, Napoleon had transformed the political map of northern Italy and demonstrated that the stalemate on the Italian front that had persisted for years was entirely a consequence of the quality of previous commanders rather than the strength of the Austrian position. He was 27 years old. He was the most celebrated military figure in France. And he had already begun doing something that would prove, in the long run, as consequential as anything he did on the battlefield. He was manufacturing his own image. The French press of the 1790s was not controlled in the systematic way that later authoritarian governments would learn to control media, but it was influenceable, and Napoleon influenced it with a deliberateness that was, for a military commander of his era, genuinely unprecedented. He understood something that most soldiers of his time did not. The story of a campaign, told the right way to the right audience, was itself a form of power. He established his own newspapers during the Italian campaign, publications that circulated among his troops and were reprinted in Paris. These publications reported the campaign in a consistent voice, one that emphasized Napoleon's personal role in every victory, explained French successes in terms of his genius, and constructed for French readers a specific narrative of what was happening in Italy and why it mattered. He commissioned paintings, the most famous image of Napoleon that most people carry in their minds, the figure on horseback crossing the Alps with dramatic gesture and billowing cloak, was painted by Jacques-Louis David in 1801, years after the actual crossing, based on Napoleon's specific instructions about how he wanted to be depicted. Multiple witnesses describe the actual crossing as Napoleon riding a mule in practical cold-weather clothing. The painting was not documentation. It was communication. He negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio himself, without waiting for authorization from Paris, making territorial decisions that were technically beyond his authority as a military commander. The Directory objected, mildly, and then accepted what he had done, because they had no practical means of undoing it, and no military figure capable of replacing him. He returned to Paris in December of 1797 to a reception that confirmed what he had suspected for months. He was more famous than the government that employed him. During this period, his letters to Josephine continued with an emotional intensity that stood in stark contrast to everything else about him. She was often unavailable, sometimes deliberately so, pursuing her own social life in Paris while he was commanding armies in Italy. He wrote to her with a longing that made his officers uncomfortable when they saw it, because it revealed a dimension of vulnerability that the general they had watched at Montenotte and Rivoli did not seem capable of. She did not write back with the same frequency or the same feeling. He knew it. He could not stop. The Directory government, watching all of this, was not entirely comfortable with a general this popular, this capable, and this clearly aware of his own political weight. The solution they arrived at was to give him something large enough to occupy him at a sufficient distance. They gave him Egypt. The Egyptian expedition was proposed in a context of genuine strategic logic. The idea of threatening British trade routes to India and establishing French influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Napoleon supported the idea publicly and had his own reasons for doing so privately. A successful Eastern campaign, following Alexander the Great's ancient route, would add a dimension to his legend that Italian victories alone could not provide. He was thinking not just about the next battle, but about how he would be remembered across centuries. He sailed for Egypt in May of 1798 with an army of approximately 35,000 soldiers in a detail that reveals something essential about the kind of empire builder he was becoming. A commission of sciences and arts, comprising 167 scholars, scientists, artists, engineers, and intellectuals whose purpose was to study, document, and ultimately explain Egypt to the European world. Napoleon understood that conquering a place and understanding a place were different projects, and that the second was in some ways more durable than the first. He was right about that. The intellectual legacy of the Egyptian expedition outlasted the military campaign by centuries. The soldier Jean, trudging back from Milan toward whatever posting came next, could not have known any of this. He could not have known that the general who had ridden past him in the Alps was already thinking about Egypt, about Alexander, about how the story of what he was doing would sound to people who would not be born for another 100 years. He knew only what he had seen. A general who looked at the ground differently than other generals. A general who moved faster. A general who, when he said fertile plains were waiting on the other side of the mountains, turned out to be telling the truth. That was enough for a soldier with worn-out boots on a cold road in the Alps. It would not be enough, eventually, for the world. Chapter 5. Egypt, the campaign that failed, and why it did not matter. On the 1st of August 1798, Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and destroyed it. Not damaged it, not forced it to retreat, destroyed it. By morning, 11 of the 13 French ships of the line had been captured or sunk. The French admiral was dead. The Army of the Orient, 35,000 men who had crossed the Mediterranean with Napoleon to remake the Eastern world, was now stranded in Egypt with no way home and no realistic prospect of reinforcement from France. Napoleon received the news with the controlled composure that observers would later identify as one of his most consistent characteristics under catastrophic pressure. He did not panic publicly. He said, with a composure that may have been genuine or may have been performance, that they were now obligated to do great things, that there was no alternative. Then he set about trying to salvage what he could from a situation that had become, in strategic terms, essentially hopeless. But let us go back slightly, because what happened before Aboukir Bay matters for understanding what came after. The French had landed near Alexandria in late June of 1798 and moved quickly inland toward Cairo. The Battle of the Pyramids, fought on the 21st of July, was a genuine military success. The Mamluk cavalry forces defending Egypt, formidable in their own tradition of warfare, were not equipped to deal with the French infantry squares that Napoleon deployed. Defensive formations that presented a continuous wall of musket fire in every direction. The Mamluks attacked with courage and were destroyed with efficiency. Cairo fell within days. Napoleon in Cairo made the same moves he had made in Italy. He established newspapers. He issued proclamations, these ones invoking Islamic religious language and presenting the French as liberators from Mamluk tyranny rather than conquerors. He set the scholars to work documenting everything. He organized an Institute of Egypt in Cairo, modeled on the Institut de France, where scientists and scholars gathered to study the country they were occupying. The scholars he had brought with him were already at work in ways that would eventually produce the Description de l'Egypte, a multi-volume work of scholarship that effectively founded the modern field of Egyptology and remains one of the most remarkable intellectual enterprises ever attached to a military campaign. Then came Aboukir Bay, and the strategic situation was transformed overnight. Napoleon's handling of the plague that struck his army during the subsequent Syrian campaign produced one of the most contested episodes of his career. He visited the plague hospital at Jaffa, touching the sores of the sick soldiers in a gesture that was either an act of genuine solidarity and contempt for his own safety, or a calculated piece of theater designed to demonstrate courage and be painted later. It was painted later by Antoine Jean Gros in a work that became one of the iconic images of the Napoleonic legend. The honest historical position is that it was probably both simultaneously. Napoleon was capable of genuine physical courage. He was also, at the same time, capable of calculating how that courage would be perceived and ensuring that it would be documented for maximum effect. The Syrian campaign reached the city of Acre, on the coast of what is now Israel, where a combined British and Ottoman force held a fortress that Napoleon besieged for 2 months. Acre did not fall. The British naval commander Sidney Smith supplied and reinforced the garrison with a skill and determination that effectively neutralized Napoleon's siege operations. The French army, weakened by plague and the brutal conditions of the campaign, retreated back to Egypt in May of 1799. Back in Egypt, the military situation stabilized into a grinding occupation that offered no obvious path to the kind of decisive outcome Napoleon required. The Ottoman Empire, supported by Britain, launched an invasion by sea in July of 1799. Napoleon defeated the landing force at the Second Battle of Abdication with a tactical efficiency that partially restored French military prestige in the region. But the fundamental situation had not changed. The army was stuck. France was far away. And what was happening in France, the news of which reached Napoleon through newspapers and dispatches, was very interesting indeed. The Directory government in Paris was in serious difficulty. The political situation was unstable. The military situation on multiple European fronts was deteriorating. And the government had lost the public confidence it needed to function. France was looking for something the Directory could not provide: competent, decisive, legitimate authority. Napoleon, reading the situation from Egypt, understood what was happening. The moment was coming, the kind of moment that comes rarely and does not wait. He left on the 22nd of August, 1799, departing Alexandria with a small fleet before British patrols could intercept him. He had said nothing to most of his officers or his army. He had selected the men he wanted with him, secured the correspondence he needed to control, and gone. Here is the fact that the heroic version of this story moves past quickly. He left approximately 25,000 French soldiers in Egypt with no realistic prospect of reinforcement or evacuation. Those soldiers were not evacuated for another 2 years. The remnants of the Army of the Orient eventually surrendered to British forces in 1801, under the terms of the Convention of Alexandria, and were repatriated. Many of those men had fought with extraordinary courage in conditions of extreme difficulty, had survived plague and desert heat and sustained military pressure, and were left to manage the consequences of a strategic situation that their commander had decided was no longer worth his personal attention. This is not a detail that appears prominently in most popular accounts of Napoleon. It is, however, a detail that is essential to understanding both the man and the method. He arrived in the south of France on the 9th of October, 1799. What happened next reveals more about Napoleon's understanding of information as power than almost anything else in his career. By the time he landed in France, the news of his departure from Egypt had not preceded him in any form that mattered. The news of his victories, particularly the Second Battle of Abdication, had reached France. The news of the failed Syrian campaign and the army he had left behind arrived more slowly and informs that he was now present to manage and contextualize. He was received in the south of France as a returning hero. Crowds gathered along the route as he traveled north toward Paris. People cheered a general who had fought at the pyramids and at Abu Qir, who represented in the public imagination something that the Directory had entirely failed to provide. He arrived in Paris on the 16th of October, 1799. Within 3 weeks, he would be the ruler of France. But pause before we follow him into that coup, because the Egyptian episode contains a lesson that is easy to miss when you are moving toward the more dramatic events that follow. Napoleon failed in Egypt. He failed strategically. Because the expedition did not achieve its objectives, he failed. By a reasonable moral assessment, because he abandoned the men under his command when remaining with them became personally inconvenient. He failed militarily, because the destruction of his fleet trapped his army and the siege of Acre stopped his campaign. He returned to France more powerful than when he left. How does that happen? It happens because the story of what happened is not the same thing as what happened. The story is what people act on. And the story of the Egyptian expedition that Napoleon allowed to circulate in France in the autumn of 1799 was not the story of a failed campaign that abandoned its army. It was the story of a brilliant general who had defeated the Mamluks, explored ancient Egypt, and fought the Ottomans before returning to save France from its own incompetent government. Both stories contain true elements. The first contains more of them. The second is the one that put Napoleon in power. At what point does the management of narrative cross from legitimate communication into something that corrodes the foundations of the system it is meant to serve? Napoleon did not ask himself that question in October of 1799. He was 30 years old, and France was waiting, and he had a coup to organize. But the question was already embedded in the method, and the answer, when it finally came, would come at enormous cost, not primarily to Napoleon, to the millions of people who lived inside the story he was constructing without their consent. Chapter 6. First Consul to Emperor: The Architecture of Authoritarian Legitimacy. On the evening of the 8th of November, 1799, in the hours before the coup that would change everything, a man named Pierre, who worked as a clerk for one of the legislative councils, sat at his desk in St. Cloud and tried to make sense of what was happening around him. He had been told, officially, that the councils had been moved from Paris to St. Cloud because of a Jacobin threat to the government. He had been told this by people who clearly did not believe it themselves. Soldiers were positioned around the building in numbers that seemed excessive for the protection of legislators from a threat that nobody could quite specify. The legislators themselves were agitated in a way that suggested they understood the official explanation as poorly as he did. Pierre would later record, in a brief memoir that historians have cited as a useful ground-level account of the day, that what struck him most was not the drama of the event, but its procedural strangeness. The forms of Republican government were being maintained with meticulous attention, even as the substance of Republican government was being dismantled in the rooms around him. The paperwork continued. The clerks continued to file documents. The official records of the session were being kept by people who were simultaneously watching soldiers take up positions at the exits. The forms and the substance had separated, and nobody quite knew what to do about that. What happened on the 9th of November, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire in the French Revolutionary calendar, has been described many times from the perspective of the people at the top. Napoleon nearly losing his nerve in the chamber of the 500. his brother Lucien saving the situation with a fabricated accusation of British gold, the deputies fleeing through the windows, the rump session approving the provisional government. What Pierre's account captures, and what the top-down accounts tend to miss, is that the coup succeeded not primarily because of what Napoleon did or what Lucien said, but because the institutional forms that might have stopped it had already been hollowed out by years of revolutionary instability. When the soldiers entered the chamber, the deputies who fled through the windows did not flee because they were cowards. They fled because they understood, in that moment, that the institutions they represented no longer had the backing that would make resistance meaningful. Napoleon understood this before the coup. He had been watching French institutions for a decade, and he knew, with the precision of someone who had spent years studying systems, exactly how much substance remained inside the Republican forms. Not enough. Within weeks, through a process of political maneuvering that moved with a speed the other two consuls could not match, Napoleon was first consul. The new constitution established a system in which all real executive power resided in the first consul. The other two consuls had consultative roles without authority. France had a republic. It had elections. It had legislative bodies. It had a constitution. And it had, beneath all of those institutional forms, a single man making the decisions that mattered. Understanding how Napoleon constructed this system and why it worked for as long as it did requires setting aside both the heroic narrative that presents everything he did as inevitable genius and the simple authoritarian narrative that presents him as merely another dictator who seized power by force. The reality was more sophisticated and, in some ways, more disturbing than either version. The first thing Napoleon did with power was something that surprised many of his supporters and alarmed many of his enemies. He governed competently. The Banque de France was established in 1800, creating a stable central banking institution that rationalized French finances. The tax collection system was reorganized with a professionalism that the revolutionary governments had failed to achieve, creating the prefectural system in which appointed officials administered the departments of France with clear lines of authority running directly to Paris. The educational system was reorganized around the lycée, a network of secondary schools that provided standardized education across France and served as the primary pipeline for training the administrative and military cadres the new state required. Then came the achievement that historians across the political spectrum most consistently identify as his most durable contribution to human civilization: the Napoleonic Code. The legal situation in France before Napoleon was a patchwork of extraordinary complexity. Northern France operated primarily under customary law that varied from region to region. Southern France operated primarily under Roman law. The result was a country in which the law that applied to you depended substantially on where you happened to be standing. Napoleon appointed a commission of 4 leading jurists to draft a unified civil code, and he participated personally in the commission's deliberations with an intensity that surprised the lawyers involved. Contemporary accounts describe him attending the commission sessions, asking sharp questions, challenging proposed formulations, and insisting on clarity of language that would be comprehensible to an educated non-specialist. The Code Civil des Français, which became known as the Code Napoleon, was promulgated in 1804. It established across all of France, and eventually across much of Europe, a uniform system of civil law based on clear principles: equality before the law, the protection of private property, freedom of contract, secular authority over marriage and the family, the abolition of feudal privileges and obligations. Legal historians, including John Merriman, in his comparative study of civil law systems, estimate that the Code Napoleon has influenced the legal systems of dozens of countries, with some estimates placing the figure at more than 70 jurisdictions when colonial and post-colonial legal inheritance is included. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, much of Latin America, and the state of Louisiana in the United States all operate within legal frameworks that trace their fundamental structure to this document. It is, by that measure, among the most geographically widespread legal instruments in human history. It also, and this requires direct acknowledgement, reversed some of the Revolution's most progressive achievements with respect to women. The Code established the legal subordination of wives to their husbands, restricting women's property rights and their ability to enter contracts without spousal permission. This was not an oversight or a compromise forced by political necessity. It reflected Napoleon's genuine views about the proper organization of the family. The man who abolished feudal privilege for men simultaneously codified a form of domestic subordination for women that the Revolution had been moving away from. The Concordat he negotiated with Pope Pius VII in 1801 gave the Church freedom to operate in France and gave the state the right to nominate bishops, replacing the destabilizing conflict of the Revolutionary decade with a managed coexistence that served Napoleon's purposes without fully satisfying either the most secular Republicans or the most devout Catholics. Napoleon reportedly described religion as a social mechanism that served specific functions in maintaining order. He was not hostile to it as a matter of policy. He was indifferent to it as a matter of personal conviction and attentive to it as a matter of political management. By 1804, Napoleon had stabilized French finances, reorganized the legal system, restored order after a decade of revolutionary turbulence, and concluded peace with Britain in the Treaty of Amiens in 1802. He had also arranged a plebiscite on the question of whether he should be made first consul for life. The historian Thierry Lentz, in his detailed study of the consulate period, documents significant manipulation in how the resulting figures were compiled and reported. The point was not the precise count. The point was the performance of popular legitimacy, the demonstration that his authority rested not merely on military force, but on the consent of the French people. Consent that could be manufactured and measured and presented as evidence of democratic foundation. He had learned how to use democratic forms to build non-democratic power. He had learned it so well that even people who understood what he was doing found it difficult to articulate a clean objection, because the objection required questioning the validity of a popular vote. And questioning popular votes opened its own uncomfortable political territory. Then he made himself emperor. In December of 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Pope Pius VII traveled from Rome to preside over the coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of the French. At the moment of coronation, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned Josephine. The gesture communicated the source of his authority with a precision that no speech could have matched. It did not come from the church. It did not come from hereditary right. It came from himself, from what he had made of himself, through 35 years of refusal to accept the limits others imposed on him. Josephine, kneeling before him in that vast cathedral to receive her crown, had traveled a distance from her cell during the Terror to the throne of France that no rational person could have predicted or planned for. She had survived. She had adapted. She had become through a combination of genuine charm and the kind of resilience that comes from having already lost everything once. The most powerful woman in Europe. She also knew, with the clarity of someone who had spent years navigating power from its edges, that the position she occupied was conditional in ways that her husband's was not. He needed an heir. She had not provided one. The mathematical logic of dynasty was already present in the background of the coronation. Quiet, but inevitable. She accepted the crown from his hands in Notre Dame with a grace that the assembled audience found moving. She would need that grace in the years to come. The clerk, Pierre, if he had been present that December day, might have recognized in the ceremony something he had observed in the chamber at St. Cloud 5 years earlier. The forms maintained with meticulous attention, the substance organized beneath them according to entirely different principles. The gap between what was being performed and what was actually happening, visible to anyone who looked carefully, irrelevant to anyone who chose not to. The emperor had been crowned. The spying question of this documentary: how does the same man who liberated nations end up destroying them? Was about to receive its first full answer. Because the emperor who had just placed a crown on his own head was the same person who had implemented the Napoleonic Code and stabilized French finances and reorganized the legal system of an entire civilization. And he was also the same person who had abandoned his army in Egypt and suppressed the press and manufactured popular consent through numbers that his own administration had manipulated. He was always both, simultaneously and without contradiction. The next decade would simply make that truth impossible to ignore. Chapter 7. Austerlitz and the Peak. On the morning of the 2nd of December, 1805, a dense fog lay across the lowlands near the village of Austerlitz in what is now the Czech Republic. Somewhere in that fog, approximately 85,000 Austrian and Russian soldiers were preparing to execute a plan they believed would destroy Napoleon's army and end the war. Somewhere else in that fog, Napoleon was walking his lines in the darkness. He had been awake since well before dawn, moving between the campfires of his approximately 73,000 men, stopping occasionally to speak with soldiers who did not immediately recognize him in the dark, and therefore spoke to him without the performance that recognition would have produced. The conversations were brief and specific. He asked about rations, about equipment, about how the men had slept. He did not ask about morale, because men who are asked about morale understand that they are being assessed, and the assessment changes the answer. He was taking the temperature of an army that was about to fight at significant numerical disadvantage against a coalition that included the personal forces of 2 emperors. He was also, simultaneously, listening for something he could not have easily explained to anyone around him. He was listening for the fog, not the weather. The strategic fog, the gap between what his opponents believed about the position of his forces and what was actually true, because the battle he had designed in the preceding days was not designed to defeat the coalition's army at the point of their greatest strength. It was designed to make them believe something false about where his weakness was, and then to punish them for believing it. To understand what happened at Austerlitz, and why it matters beyond its immediate military result, you have to first understand what Napoleon was facing in the autumn of 1805. The Third Coalition, formed in 1805, brought together Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden against France. The Allied plan was a coordinated offensive on multiple fronts that would overwhelm French resources by forcing simultaneous military responses in different theaters. Napoleon had spent the spring and summer of 1805 preparing to invade Britain. assembling the Grande Armée at the camp of Boulogne on the Channel coast. The invasion never happened, partly because the French Navy failed to achieve the channel control that would have made it possible. A failure confirmed at the Battle of Trafalgar in October of 1805, where Nelson destroyed a combined French and Spanish fleet. But the camp at Boulogne had produced something more valuable than an invasion force. It had produced an army of extraordinary quality. The soldiers who had spent 2 years training and developing unit cohesion at Boulogne were capable of moving at speeds and maintaining tactical coordination under pressure that consistently surprised opponents who had not experienced it. When the Austrian declaration of war came in August of 1805, Napoleon turned this instrument from the Channel to the east with a speed that astonished everyone watching. The Austrian General Mack had advanced into Bavaria with approximately 70,000 men, expecting to hold the line of the Danube while waiting for the Russian armies to arrive and join him. It was a conventional strategy based on the conventional assumption that a large French army would take weeks to move from the Channel coast to southern Germany. Napoleon moved the Grande Armée from Boulogne to the Rhine and then south across Germany in approximately 6 weeks, covering roughly 800 kilometers while maintaining the army's fighting effectiveness. He then swung a massive force around Mack's northern flank, cutting the Austrian army off from its line of retreat to Vienna. Mack, finding himself surrounded at Ulm with no viable military option, surrendered his entire force of approximately 27,000 men on the 20th of October, 1805. Without a major battle, Napoleon entered Vienna on the 13th of November. But the war was not over. Kutuzov's Russian army had united with surviving Austrian forces into a combined force of roughly 85,000. They were moving to confront Napoleon. Both the Russian Emperor Alexander I and the Austrian Emperor Francis II were present in person. The position Napoleon chose for the battle was not chosen at random. He had ridden over the ground near the village of Austerlitz and identified a specific feature of the landscape that his tactical analysis told him an aggressive enemy commander would inevitably try to use. The Pratzen Heights were a low plateau rising above the surrounding ground. The dominant terrain feature in the area, every conventional military analysis would conclude that whoever held the Pratzen Heights controlled the battlefield. An enemy arriving to attack the French position would almost certainly try to seize them. Napoleon decided not to hold the heights. He pulled his forces back from the plateau, deliberately weakening his right flank and making the heights appear unoccupied and vulnerable. He positioned his approximately 73,000 men with his strongest forces on his left. He arranged his center to drive up onto the plateau the moment the enemy descended from it. The plan required the enemy to do exactly what Napoleon predicted. In a deception of this kind, if the enemy does not cooperate, the plan collapses. If your own forces mistime their movements, the plan collapses. On the morning of the 2nd of December, the Allied commanders looked at the Pratzen Heights, saw that they appeared weakly held, and sent their best troops to seize them. Napoleon waited until the Allied forces had descended from the heights and committed to the movement. Then he sent the corps of Marshal Nicholas Soult straight up the slope. The assault on the Pratzen Heights took approximately 20 minutes. The Allied forces that had just crossed it found themselves caught between Soult's corps driving up from one side and their own troops still trying to advance in the other direction. The Allied center was split. The right flank, now isolated, faced the concentrated French strength that Napoleon had positioned precisely for this moment. The battle lasted approximately 9 hours. By its end, the Allied army had lost approximately 36,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. French casualties were approximately 9,000. Alexander I reportedly wept. Francis II requested an armistice the following day. David Chandler, in his comprehensive analysis of Napoleonic campaigns, describes Austerlitz as the most perfectly executed battle of Napoleon's career. Military historian John Elting identifies it as one of the most complete tactical victories in European military history. The Peace of Pressburg, signed on the 26th of December, 1805, imposed terms on Austria that reshaped the political map of Central Europe. Austria surrendered significant territories and was effectively removed as a major power in Germany and Italy. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed in some form for over 1,000 years, was dissolved in 1806. In its place, Napoleon organized the Confederation of the Rhine, a grouping of German states under French protection. He was 36 years old. He had destroyed the Third Coalition in approximately 3 months. He controlled, directly or through client states, most of continental Europe west of Russia. The grand empire that Napoleon was building in the years following Austerlitz represented the most ambitious attempt to reorganize Europe under a single authority since the Roman Empire. He placed his brothers on the thrones of kingdoms he created or reorganized. His legal code replaced the chaotic accumulation of feudal law across the continent. Andrew Roberts, in his biography, argues that the Grand Empire represented a genuine vision of European integration rather than merely personal aggrandizement. The historian Stuart Wolfe, in his study of Napoleonic Europe, published in 1991, documents the genuine administrative and legal improvements that French model institutions brought to territories across Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. These were real changes that benefited real people, and they did not disappear entirely when Napoleon's empire collapsed. But here, at the peak, is precisely where honesty requires adding what the triumph conceals. The man who walked his lines in the darkness before Austerlitz, listening to his soldiers speak without the performance that recognition would have produced, was the same man who had abandoned those soldiers' predecessors in Egypt when remaining with them became personally inconvenient. The battle plan that worked so perfectly because he was willing to take risks that his opponents could not imagine was built on the same absolute confidence in his own judgment that would lead him, in a few years, to dismiss the logistical warnings his staff raised before Russia. Austerlitz confirmed something in Napoleon that was already there. The conviction that his analysis of a situation was not merely better than his opponents, but categorically superior in ways that rendered their resistance ultimately futile. The conviction that with sufficient speed and sufficient will, any obstacle could be overcome. At Austerlitz, that conviction produced a plan of extraordinary elegance that worked precisely because his opponents could not imagine anyone taking the risks it required. In the years ahead, the same conviction would produce decisions where the obstacles were not armies that could be outmaneuvered, but peoples and distances and winters that did not respond to tactical genius. You cannot have the Pratzen Heights without the blind spots that made Spain and Russia possible. They come from the same source. The absolute confidence in your own judgment that allows you to attempt what others consider impossible also makes it harder, and eventually impossible, to give adequate weight to evidence that a particular impossibility is actually impossible. The answer to the spine question of this documentary, how does the same man who liberated nations end up destroying them, is not that he changed. It is that he stayed the same. At Austerlitz, the world had not yet found a way to make that sameness cost him everything. It was still learning. Chapter 8. Spain and the First Wound. In the spring of 1808, somewhere on the road between Madrid and the French border. A Spanish priest watched a column of French soldiers march past his village and made a decision that Napoleon's entire strategic framework had no category for. He did not assess the military balance. He did not calculate the odds of resistance against the most powerful army in Europe. He picked up a weapon and decided that the occupation of his country by a foreign army was something he would not accept, regardless of the consequences to himself personally. He was not a soldier. He had no training, no unit, no chain of command. He had a grievance and a willingness to act on it that no calculation of force ratios could predict or contain. Multiply that decision by tens of thousands of similar decisions made by similar people across an entire country, and you have the thing that Napoleon called the Spanish ulcer, the wound that did not heal, that consumed resources steadily without producing the decisive outcome that would allow those resources to stop flowing, that bled the greatest empire in Europe for 6 years without ever delivering the single moment of resolution that Napoleon's military system was designed to produce. To understand how Napoleon walked into Spain, you have to understand the strategic logic that made it seem reasonable at the time, because it was not an impulsive decision. It emerged from a chain of calculations that were individually defensible and collectively catastrophic. The Continental System was Napoleon's attempt to defeat Britain economically after Trafalgar had made a military defeat of Britain at sea effectively impossible. The logic was straightforward. Britain was a commercial economy that depended on European markets. If Napoleon could close every European port to British trade, he could strangle the British economy and force Britain to a peace that recognized French dominance of Europe. The system required that every European coastline be closed to British ships and British goods. Every coastline, including Portugal, which was Britain's oldest ally and whose ports were a primary conduit for British trade into Europe. Portugal refused to comply. Napoleon demanded compliance. Portugal continued to refuse. In the autumn of 1807, Napoleon negotiated an agreement with the Spanish government that allowed French forces to cross Spanish territory to invade Portugal. By November of 1807, a French army had crossed Spain and occupied Lisbon. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil on British ships. So far, the logic held. Portugal was closed to British trade. But Napoleon was looking at Spain itself with the specific attention of a man who sees a problem and cannot stop himself from trying to solve it. The Spanish government under King Charles IV and Prime Minister Manuel Godoy was, by any fair assessment, a mess. Charles was weak. Godoy was widely despised. The king's son Ferdinand had organized a faction against Godoy that had produced open conflict within the royal family. His reasoning went approximately as follows. Spain was an unreliable ally because its government was too unstable to be trusted. The instability was a problem for the continental system because an unstable Spain might not maintain port closures consistently. The solution was to replace the unstable Bourbon monarchy with a reliable French client. He had done this successfully elsewhere. A similar arrangement in Spain would secure the entire Iberian Peninsula and remove a persistent source of strategic uncertainty. What this reasoning missed, completely and fatally, was the difference between the populations of the kingdoms where Napoleon had previously installed client rulers and the population of Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in the Low Countries. French-imposed reorganization had often replaced genuinely oppressive feudal structures with legal systems that significant portions of the population found preferable to what had come before. There were populations in these territories who experienced French reorganization as improvement rather than conquest. Spain was different in ways that Napoleon's information sources did not adequately convey, and his assumptions prevented him from fully weighing. Spanish society in 1808 was organized around two institutions of extraordinary depth and popular legitimacy: the monarchy and the Catholic Church. Both were objects of genuine popular attachment that went into the daily life, the identity, and the emotional world of ordinary Spanish people in ways that had no precise equivalent in the territories where French reorganization had worked. When Napoleon maneuvered the Spanish royal family to Bayonne in the spring of 1808, forced both Charles and Ferdinand to renounce their claims to the throne, and announced that his brother Joseph would be King of Spain. He was not, in his own analysis, doing anything structurally different from what he had done in Naples. He was replacing an ineffective government with a more reliable one. The Spanish people saw it differently. On the 2nd of May, 1808, the population of Madrid rose against the French garrison in a spontaneous uprising that French forces suppressed with the systematic ferocity that Francisco Goya documented in paintings that remain among the most powerful depictions of war's reality ever created. The killings that followed on the 3rd of May, in which French troops executed large numbers of Spanish prisoners taken during the uprising, did not end the resistance. They ignited it across the entire country. What followed was not a war in any sense that Napoleon's military system was designed to fight. It was a guerrilla conflict, the word guerrilla itself entering military vocabulary from this war, in which small bands of Spanish fighters operated across the entire country, attacking French supply lines, killing isolated soldiers, gathering intelligence for the British forces that landed in Portugal in August of 1808 under Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington, and then melting back into the population before French forces could bring concentrated strength to bear. Napoleon's army in Spain was never fighting the Spanish army in any systematic sense. It was fighting the Spanish people, and the Spanish people had decided that the French occupation was intolerable and that any cost was preferable to acceptance. The conventional military response to guerrilla warfare, the response that French commanders in Spain applied with increasing ferocity, was collective punishment. Villages suspected of sheltering guerrillas were burned. Civilian populations were held responsible for attacks on French soldiers. Executions were conducted to deter further resistance. The logic failed, not because the Spanish population was indifferent to the costs, which were enormous and real, but because the costs of submission felt worse than the costs of resistance in a way that external calculation could not account for. This was not strategic assessment. It was identity. And identity, when sufficiently mobilized, does not respond to the logic of cost-benefit analysis. Napoleon came to Spain personally in November of 1808, after a French army under General Pierre Dupont had surrendered to Spanish forces at Bayonne in July, the first significant French army to surrender in open field conditions since the Revolution. The surrender at Bayonne sent a signal across Europe that would reverberate for years. The Grande Armée was not invincible. It could be beaten. Napoleon's personal intervention in the autumn and winter of 1808 was militarily effective in the narrow sense. He drove Wellington's forces back to Portugal, defeated the Spanish armies in the field, and captured Madrid again. He appeared, briefly, to have stabilized the situation. Then he left, called back to Central Europe by the Austrian mobilization that would lead to the campaign of 1809. And the moment he was gone, the guerrilla war resumed with an intensity that none of his marshals could suppress. Historians estimate that the Peninsular War consumed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 French soldiers over its duration, through combat, disease, and the particular lethality of guerrilla warfare in territory that offered no safe lines of communication. It required the permanent commitment of a force of that scale that was not available for the campaigns in Central Europe and Russia that would prove decisive. It gave Wellington the laboratory in which to develop and test an army and a tactical system capable of defeating French forces in open battle, a capability that would matter enormously at Waterloo 7 years later. It also demonstrated to every government in Europe that Napoleon's empire was not as stable as it appeared. A country of perhaps 10 million people, without a functioning national army for much of the conflict, had stalemated the military machine of the most powerful empire in Europe for 6 years. If Spain could do that, what might a genuinely coordinated coalition of European powers accomplish? The answers to those questions were already being calculated in the courts of St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Berlin as the Spanish War ground on. Napoleon understood what Spain had cost him. He said so explicitly. In conversations during his first exile on Elba and in the dictations he gave at Saint Helena, he called it his greatest mistake. He acknowledged that the manner of the takeover, the cynicism of luring the royal family to Bayonne under false pretenses, had been a moral error that generated the popular reaction it deserved. But understanding a mistake in retrospect is not the same as being able to avoid it at the time. The qualities that made Napoleon's Spain decision a mistake were not qualities he could have simply set aside. His contempt for political constraints he considered irrational. His confidence that military force could solve problems that were fundamentally cultural. His assumption that what had worked in one context would work in a sufficiently similar context. These were not incidental features of his character. They were structural features of the same mind that had produced Austerlitz. The priest on the road outside his village had understood something about his own country that the most powerful man in Europe had not bothered to understand before he sent his army into it. That some things could not be administered into existence or out of existence. That some attachments were not rational in the sense that Napoleon's calculations required them to be, and were therefore not vulnerable to the kind of pressure that rational calculations generate. The priest did not win the war in Spain. Wellington's army and the Spanish guerrillas and the accumulated cost of an unwinnable occupation won it. Eventually, over 6 grinding years. But the priest understood something first. And in that gap between what he understood and what Napoleon understood lay the first deep crack in an empire that had seemed, from the summit of Austerlitz, to have no ceiling. Chapter 9. Russia, the Hubris Campaign. Consider a single road stretching east from the Polish border toward Moscow. In the summer of 1812, on that road, for a stretch of several hundred kilometers, there are men and horses and wagons as far as the eye can see in either direction. The soldiers are from France, Poland, Prussia, Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, and a dozen other nations that Napoleon's empire has swallowed or subordinated. They speak different languages, follow different customs, and pray to different versions of God. What unites them is that they are marching toward Russia because one man decided they should. Historians, including Adam Zamoyski, whose account of the 1812 campaign published in 2004 is among the most thorough available, and Rory Muir, in his military analysis of the Napoleonic period, estimate that fewer than 100,000 men returned from Russia as organized fighting units, with the precise figure varying depending on how and where the count is taken. The honest position is that the exact number cannot be established with certainty from available records. But the scale of the catastrophe is not in dispute. The temptation, when confronting those numbers, is to reach for the word destiny, to say that Russia was where Napoleon's fate was decided, that the combination of vast distances, extreme cold, and Russian determination represented forces beyond any human capacity to overcome. This is a comfortable narrative. It is also, in important ways, wrong. Russia was not lost to forces beyond human control. Russia was lost to a sequence of specific decisions made by a specific person at specific moments when different choices were available and when the evidence for making those different choices was visible to anyone paying attention. The invasion of Russia in 1812 had been building toward confrontation for several years. The relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had been deteriorating since their meeting at Tilsit in 1807, where they had divided Europe between them in an agreement that both men understood as temporary. Alexander had agreed at Tilsit to join the continental system. As the years passed, the economic damage the system inflicted on Russia became increasingly apparent and unpopular with the Russian nobility and merchant class, whose income depended on trade with Britain. By 1811, Russia had effectively abandoned the continental system, allowing British goods to enter Russian ports. Napoleon, for whom the continental system was the cornerstone of his strategy against Britain, could not accept this without accepting that his strategic framework was failing. Napoleon's plan for the Russian campaign was not simply to march on Moscow and force a Russian capitulation. It was more sophisticated than that, though the sophistication contained within it the assumptions that would prove fatal. His operational concept was to force a decisive battle near the western frontier of Russia, destroy the Russian armies in the field before they could retreat deep into Russian territory, and then dictate terms from a position of overwhelming military advantage. This was exactly the model that had worked at Austerlitz, at Jena in 1806 against Prussia, and at Wagram in 1809 against Austria. The Russian commanders made the same decision independently and reached the same conclusion. They would not give Napoleon the decisive battle he was seeking near the frontier. They would retreat. They would trade space for time, drawing the French army deeper into Russian territory, extending its supply lines, exposing it to the Russian climate, and waiting for the attrition of distance and hunger and disease to do what Russian armies in the field might not be able to do directly. The supply system of the Grande Armée was designed for the kind of rapid, decisive campaign that had succeeded in Central Europe. It assumed that the army would move quickly through populated, agriculturally productive territory, living partly off the land while supply wagons kept pace behind. The Russian campaign invalidated both assumptions simultaneously. The Russian territory was vast and sparsely populated by Western European standards. The villages the army passed through offered far less locally available food than French armies in Germany or Italy had been able to requisition. As the Russian retreat continued, Russian forces and the retreating civilian population practiced a deliberate scorched earth policy, destroying food stocks, burning crops, and driving livestock away before the French advance could reach them. Horses died in enormous numbers throughout the campaign, which compounded every other logistical problem, because horses were required to pull the supply wagons, to move the artillery, and to provide the cavalry essential for reconnaissance and pursuit. By the time the French army reached Smolensk in mid-August, it had already lost approximately 100,000 men to disease, hunger, straggling, and cavalry skirmishes. before a major battle had been fought. Napoleon at Smolensk faced a decision that should have been, by any rational military analysis, relatively clear. His army had already suffered catastrophic attrition without a decisive engagement. The logistical situation was not going to improve as the army moved further east. Winter was coming. The rational course was to halt at Smolensk, establish a defensible winter position, consolidate his force, rebuild his supply system, and resume the campaign in the spring from a position of greater strength. He did not stop. The reasons he did not stop reveal something essential about the mechanism by which his genius became his destruction, and they connect directly to the spine question we have been carrying since the beginning. The same man who liberated nations by implementing legal codes and abolishing feudal privilege was also the man who could not stop at Smolensk, not because he lacked the intelligence to see what stopping would mean. He had more intelligence than almost anyone in the room. He could not stop because stopping required accepting a limit. And accepting limits was the one thing he had been refusing to do since a French boy at Brienne first told him he did not belong there. He needed a decisive battle. His entire strategic logic required it. An inconclusive campaign that ended with the Russian army intact and a French army wintering in Smolensk was not a victory. It was a stalemate. And a stalemate in Russia was, politically and militarily, tantamount to a defeat. If he stopped at Smolensk, Alexander might not negotiate. The coalition powers watching might interpret a halt as weakness. The momentum that had carried him through every previous campaign would be broken. And momentum, he understood intuitively, was one of the primary instruments of his power. He also believed, with the confidence that had been correct so many times before, that the Russian army would eventually have to stand and fight, and that when it did, he would destroy it as he had destroyed every European army that had stood against him. The problem was that this belief was based on experience with opponents who shared his assumptions about what a decisive battle meant and why it was necessary. The Russian commanders, and to some extent the Russian political culture, did not share those assumptions in the same way. Kutuzov finally gave him the battle at Borodino. On the 7th of September, 1812, approximately 110 kilometers west of Moscow. The Battle of Borodino was the largest single-day engagement of the Napoleonic Wars in terms of total casualties. French casualties are estimated at approximately 35,000 killed and wounded. Russian casualties are estimated at approximately 45,000. Though these figures involve genuine uncertainty, given the conditions under which they were recorded, by the narrow accounting of a traditional military engagement, it was a French victory. The Russian army retreated. Napoleon held the field. He did not destroy the Russian army. Kutuzov withdrew in good order, preserving the fighting capacity of the force. The Russian army that retreated from Borodino was battered and diminished, but intact as a military organization. It would fight again. Napoleon at Borodino had the option of committing his elite reserve to the pursuit after the Russian line had been broken. His marshals urged him to do it. Those men committed at the right moment might have converted a tactical victory into the decisive destruction of the Russian army that the entire campaign required. He did not commit them. His explanation was that he would not risk his last reserve 800 leagues from France. It was a rational consideration. It was also a departure from the kind of calculated risk-taking that had produced his greatest successes. At Austerlitz, he had taken risks that his opponents considered reckless and had been vindicated. At Borodino, he was conservative at the moment when aggression might have changed everything. And the Russian army survived to fight on. He entered Moscow on the 14th of September. The city was burning. The Russian governor Fyodor Rostopchin had ordered the destruction of the city's food stocks and much of its infrastructure, rather than allow it to serve as a resource for the French army. Napoleon established himself in the Kremlin and waited for Alexander to send peace negotiators. Alexander did not send peace negotiators. He waited 5 weeks. No negotiators came. The city around him continued to burn in sections. Disease spread through the army. The supply situation did not improve. The Russian army, which had retreated south of Moscow, was rebuilding its strength and beginning to threaten French supply lines. On the 19th of October, Napoleon ordered the retreat from Moscow. The retreat became one of history's most documented catastrophes, recorded in the memoirs of survivors with a vividness that reflects the extremity of what they experienced. The temperature dropped dramatically in November, reaching levels that the army's clothing and equipment were not designed for. Men died of cold, of hunger, of exhaustion, and of the increasingly aggressive Russian cavalry and Cossack forces that harassed the retreating columns continuously. The crossing of the Berezina River, in late November, where the remnants of the Grande Armée crossed under Russian attack on bridges constructed under fire by French engineers who worked in freezing water until many of them died, was the operational low point of the retreat. Enormous numbers of people, including many non-combatant camp followers, died or were captured at the Berezina crossing. Think of the soldier Jean, whom we met on the road in the Alps in 1796, the man who had noticed that the general rode differently than other generals, thought differently, moved faster, the man who had survived Italy and gone home to Lyon with a letter his family found difficult to believe. Jean did not survive Russia. Neither did most of the men who had made that crossing of the Alps with him. The army that had been forged at Boulogne and proven at Austerlitz and tested in Spain was gone. Not defeated by an equal, consumed by distance and cold and the specific kind of war that Napoleon's genius was not designed to fight. Napoleon left the army in December, handing command to his marshal, Joachim Murat, and returning to Paris by sleigh. He arrived on the 18th of December 1812. He had been gone 7 months. The army he had led into Russia no longer existed as a fighting force. Now sit with the sequence of decisions that produced this outcome, because the destiny narrative obscures them, and they deserve to be seen clearly. He invaded Russia without an adequate supply system for the scale and duration of the campaign. The logistical problems were known to his staff before the campaign began. He chose to proceed anyway, believing that speed and a decisive battle would make the supply system's limitations irrelevant. He advanced past Smolensk when the rational military analysis supported halting and consolidating. He chose to continue, believing that one more advance would produce the decisive battle he needed. He did not commit his reserve at Borodino when his marshals believed the moment required it. He chose caution at precisely the moment when his previous successes had been built on calculated boldness. He waited 5 weeks in Moscow for negotiations that were never going to come, because he could not accept that Alexander had made a decision that his own strategic logic told him no rational leader would make. Each of these decisions was made by the same mind that produced Austerlitz. The qualities that made them wrong were not different qualities from the ones that had made Austerlitz right. They were the same qualities applied in circumstances where they no longer worked. The army was gone. Europe was watching, and the conclusions the watching powers were drawing would produce, within months, a coalition unlike anything Napoleon had yet faced. Not because they had found a general better than Napoleon, because they had finally understood that the way to fight him was not to try to outthink him on a battlefield where his thinking was without equal. It was to outlast him. Chapter 10. The Collapse Leipzig, Abdication, and Elba. There is a scene from the winter campaign of 1814 that most Napoleon biographies mention briefly and then move past, and that deserves more attention than it usually receives. By February of 1814, the coalition armies of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and their allies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing toward Paris from multiple directions. Napoleon was opposing them with an army that was a fraction of the size of any force he had commanded at the height of his power. He was operating in the country he had spent his entire career defending, on terrain he knew, with the kind of interior lines that had always favored his style of fighting. And, for approximately 2 weeks, he won. At Champaubert on the 10th of February, he defeated a Russian corps. At Montmirail 2 days later, he defeated a combined Russian and Prussian force. At Château Thierry the following day, he struck again. At Vauchamps on the 14th, he caught and destroyed another Prussian force. 4 victories in 5 days, with an army that should not have been capable of winning any of them. The officers who watched him during those February weeks later described something they found difficult to articulate. He seemed to be fighting at a level beyond anything they had seen from him before, as though the complete stripping away of every advantage had clarified something rather than diminishing it. And none of it was enough, because the coalition had learned. They held to their agreement not to make separate peace. When Napoleon struck north and destroyed one force, the others continued advancing. When he wheeled and struck south, the northern forces resumed their movement. The strategy that had always worked before, destroy one enemy at a time before they can combine, was no longer available because the coalition's political commitment to collective action had effectively neutralized it. Every victory was buying him days, not weeks. To understand how Napoleon reached this point, we need to go back to Leipzig. After the Russian catastrophe, Napoleon had done what very few people in history have been capable of doing in similar circumstances. He raised a new army. Within approximately 6 months of returning from Russia, he had conscripted, equipped, and deployed a force of approximately 350,000 men. The achievement was extraordinary by any standard of military administration. It was also an achievement built on the bodies of a generation of French men who had not yet been called upon and who were now being summoned to repair the consequences of decisions they had played no part in making. The conscription class of 1813 was drawn heavily from men who were younger than the legal conscription age had previously required. The new army was willing, but it was not the instrument that had crossed into Russia. It lacked the tactical experience and the instinctive coordination of veteran units that had been the foundation of French military superiority. The spring campaign of 1813 produced a series of French victories, most notably at Lutzen in May and at Bautzen later the same month, that demonstrated that Napoleon's personal military genius was not diminished even when the instrument he was wielding was, but winning battles was no longer sufficient. The Sixth Coalition that formed against Napoleon in 1813 was qualitatively different from the coalitions he had broken before. They agreed, formally and in writing, not to make separate peace with Napoleon. The Treaty of Chaumont, signed in March of 1814, but reflecting an understanding that had been developing since the formation of the Sixth Coalition, bound Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia to continue fighting until Napoleon was defeated, regardless of what terms he offered any individual partner. The agreement was enforced by British financial subsidies that gave each coalition partner a material incentive to maintain the alliance. The Austrian foreign minister Clemens von Metternich had spent months attempting to negotiate a compromise peace that would have preserved a reduced French empire in exchange for Napoleon accepting limitations on French power in Central Europe. The negotiations between Metternich and Napoleon in June of 1813, particularly their meeting at Dresden, produced one of the most revealing exchanges of Napoleon's career. Metternich offered terms that would have preserved France's natural frontiers and Napoleon's position as emperor in exchange for significant territorial concessions. The terms were not generous, but they were survivable. Napoleon rejected them. After Dresden, Austria joined the coalition. The Battle of Leipzig. They fought over 4 days, from the 16th to the 19th of October, 1813. Is known in German history as the Völkerschlacht, the Battle of the Nations. The coalition forces numbered approximately 330,000. Napoleon commanded approximately 190,000. On the third day of fighting, the Saxon forces fighting in Napoleon's army defected to the coalition side in the middle of the battle, a symbolic collapse of the political system Napoleon had constructed in Germany. On the fourth day, as the French army retreated through Leipzig, the only bridge over the Elster River was blown prematurely, trapping approximately 30,000 French soldiers on the wrong side. The men were killed, captured, or drowned attempting to swim the river. Napoleon crossed the Rhine with approximately 80,000 men. He had entered Germany in the spring with 3 times that number. What followed was the campaign of France in the winter and spring of 1814. Those extraordinary weeks in February, when Napoleon was winning battles that changed nothing about the strategic outcome. The coalition had too many armies converging from too many directions, and the agreement not to make separate peace held. Paris fell on the 30th of March, 1814. Coalition forces entered the French capital for the first time since the medieval period. Napoleon was at Fontainebleau when he received the news, still planning a counteroffensive that his marshals had already concluded was impossible. The marshals told him so, en Bayonne. They made clear that they would not lead their armies in a campaign to retake Paris. The army, the instrument that had been the foundation of everything Napoleon had built, was refusing to follow him further. He abdicated on the 6th of April, 1814, signing a document that renounced his throne for himself and his heirs. In the days that followed, he also learned of Josephine's death. She had been living at Malmaison, the estate outside Paris she had always loved, maintaining cordial relations with Napoleon through letters and occasional meetings since their divorce. She had received the coalition leaders with a grace that reflected the universal recognition that she was something separate from the political entity she had once embodied as empress. Tsar Alexander had visited her there with a courtesy that Napoleon's enemies rarely extended to those associated with him. She died on the 29th of May, 1814, of an illness affecting her respiratory system. While Napoleon was already on Elba, he was told the news by a courier and did not leave his rooms for 2 days. The woman who had not loved him the way he loved her had outlasted his empire by less than 2 months. He had divorced her 4 years earlier in the cold logic of dynasty, because she had not provided the heir he required. He had replaced her with a younger woman, the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, who gave him a son in 1811 and who bore the particular burden of being married to the man who had defeated her father multiple times in the field. Marie-Louise navigated this situation with a dignity that the historical record, which tends to dismiss her, does not adequately acknowledge. But it was Josephine's death, not Marie-Louise's circumstance, that broke something in Napoleon during those 2 days at Elba when he did not come out of his rooms. The Treaty of Fontainebleau gave Napoleon sovereignty over the island of Elba, off the Tuscan coast, with an annual income, a personal guard of 600 soldiers, and the title of Emperor of Elba, a designation that carried the specific cruelty of maintaining the form of imperial authority with none of its substance. He attempted suicide on the night of the 12th of April, taking a poison he had carried since the Russian campaign. The poison had degraded over time and was not lethal. He survived. He arrived on Elba in May of 1814 and began, with the same methodical energy he had brought to every previous challenge, to govern his small island. He reorganized its administration. He improved its roads. He inspected its iron mines. He reviewed his small guard. He also maintained an intelligence network that followed events in France and in Vienna, where the great powers were meeting to reorganize Europe at the Congress of Vienna, with the attention of a man who had not yet accepted that his career was over. The February victories in France had shown him something important about what he was still capable of. The political reports reaching him from the continent were showing him something equally important about how the restored Bourbon monarchy was managing its transition. He was already planning. The question was not whether he would return. The question was when. Chapter 11. The 100 Days, the most reckless gamble in European history. On the 1st of March, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped ashore on the coast of the south of France with approximately 1,100 soldiers and no particular plan beyond the conviction that France would receive him. He was right. What followed over the next 20 days was one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in modern European history, and it has never been fully explained to the satisfaction of everyone who has tried to explain it, not because the facts are unclear, but because the facts are so improbable that they resist the frameworks we normally use to understand political and military events. The soldiers sent to stop him joined him instead. A regiment dispatched from Grenoble to intercept the advancing column met Napoleon on the road at a place called Laffrey. Napoleon rode out alone from his escort, within musket range of the regiment, opened his coat, and told them that if any of them wished to shoot their emperor, they should do it now. Nobody shot. They cheered. They fell in behind him. Marshal Michel Ney, who had told Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, met the advancing column near Auxerre and went over to Napoleon's side with his entire force. Regiment after regiment that was dispatched to intercept the return of the former emperor instead cheered him and fell in behind him. Louis XVIII fled Paris on the 19th of March. Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace on the 20th. He had reclaimed France in 20 days with virtually no bloodshed. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what the restored Bourbon monarchy had done in the 10 months since Napoleon's abdication to make the population of France receptive to his return. The army officers who had served Napoleon found themselves passed over in favor of returning émigrés who had spent the revolutionary and Napoleonic decades outside France. The peasants who had acquired land under the revolutionary reorganization of property found themselves anxious about whether the restored monarchy intended to reverse the land settlements that represented their most tangible gain from 25 years of upheaval. The veterans who had fought Napoleon's wars were not reconciled to the new order. Napoleon had also understood something about the political situation in Vienna that made his timing specific rather than random. The great powers assembled at the Congress of Vienna were in serious disagreement about territorial questions, particularly regarding Poland and Saxony. He had calculated that their unity, which had destroyed him in 1813 and 1814, might not reassemble with the same speed and completeness in response to his return. He was partially wrong about that calculation, but the margin of his error was not large enough to stop him. The coalition powers assembled at Vienna declared him an outlaw on the 13th of March, before he had even reached Paris. In language unprecedented in European diplomatic history, Britain alone committed £5 million immediately to financing the military response. Wellington was appointed to command the Allied forces gathering in Belgium. The Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher was already mobilizing. Napoleon's window of opportunity, if one existed at all, was extremely narrow. He needed to defeat the Allied forces gathering in Belgium before the Austrian and Russian armies could arrive from the east. If he could destroy Wellington and Blücher before the larger coalition force was assembled, he might create a military situation that gave the coalition political reason to negotiate. If he could not, the arithmetic of Europe, united against France, would grind him down, as it had in 1813 and 1814. He concentrated approximately 124,000 men on the Belgian frontier and crossed on the 15th of June, 1815, driving a wedge between Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army to the west and Blücher's Prussian army to the east, attempting to defeat each separately before they could combine. The plan was conceptually sound. It was the same operational logic he had used successfully at Ulm and at the opening of the Austerlitz campaign. Divide the enemy. Defeat in detail. Exploit before they can recover. At Ligny, on the 16th of June, Napoleon attacked Blücher's Prussians and won a tactical victory, inflicting approximately 16,000 casualties and forcing the Prussians to retreat. It was a genuine French victory. It was not the decisive destruction of the Prussian army that the plan required. Blücher's force retreated north in good order, maintaining its cohesion as a fighting force, rather than retreating east away from Wellington as Napoleon had assumed it would. The direction of the Prussian retreat was the first critical variable that did not behave as anticipated. Marshal Ney, commanding the French left wing, fought Wellington's forces at Quatre Bras on the same day and achieved neither a decisive victory nor the capture of the crossroads that was his objective. Wellington's army remained intact and in position. Napoleon ordered Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy to pursue the Prussians with approximately 33,000 men, with instructions to prevent them from joining Wellington. Grouchy pursued, but he pursued in a direction that kept his force separated from the main army at the critical moment. Whether Grouchy's failure to march toward the sound of guns on the 18th of June represented a catastrophic failure of initiative on his part, or whether Napoleon's orders genuinely bound him to the course he chose, is one of the most debated operational questions in military history. The honest answer is that the orders Napoleon gave were ambiguous enough to support both interpretations, and that ambiguity in orders at a critical moment was itself a failure of command. On the 17th of June, Wellington withdrew his forces north to a position he had reconnoitered before the campaign began, a ridge south of the village of Waterloo, near the farm complexes of Hougoumont to the west and La Haye-Sainte in the center. He intended to fight there if he received confirmation that Prussian support was coming. Blücher, despite being wounded at Ligny, sent word that the Prussians would march to support Wellington on the 18th. Many historians argue that the timing of Napoleon's attack on the morning of the 18th of June was a significant error, pointing out that every hour of postponement gave Blücher's army additional time to close the distance to the battlefield. Others, including Andrew Roberts, in his detailed analysis of the campaign, argue that the ground genuinely needed time to dry after heavy rain, and that an earlier attack on wet ground would have negated the French artillery advantage. The debate has not been resolved to universal satisfaction, and probably cannot be, given the variables involved. What is not disputed is that the Prussians were closer to Waterloo by the time the battle began than they would have been had it started earlier. The fighting at Hougoumont Farm on Wellington's right consumed French resources in ways the operational plan had not anticipated. The farm complex was garrisoned by British and Dutch troops, who defended it with extraordinary tenacity through hours of assault. Napoleon reinforced the attack on Hougoumont repeatedly, drawing strength away from the main effort in the center. The assault on Wellington's center was repulsed. Ney then ordered a massive cavalry charge against Wellington's infantry squares without adequate artillery preparation and without infantry support to exploit any breakthrough the cavalry might achieve. Wellington's infantry squares held. The French cavalry suffered enormous casualties without breaking the British line. Ney captured La Haie-Sainte Farm in the center at approximately 6 in the evening, creating a gap in Wellington's line that represented the last genuine French opportunity. He sent word to Napoleon requesting reinforcements, specifically fresh infantry, to exploit the opening before Wellington could seal it. Napoleon refused. He said he had no more infantry to give. The portion of the Imperial Guard held in reserve numbered in the thousands and had not yet been committed. Whether those men, sent forward at the moment Ney requested them, could have broken Wellington's line before the Prussians arrived in decisive strength is one of history's genuine open questions. Military historians remain divided. What is not divided is the consequence of the refusal. The gap in Wellington's line closed. The Prussians began arriving on Napoleon's right flank in force. Napoleon sent the Guard forward late in the evening in a final attempt to break the British line after the Prussian presence had already changed the tactical situation beyond recovery. The Guard advanced up the slope toward Wellington's position, came under concentrated fire from British infantry that Wellington had carefully positioned to maximize its effect, and stopped. Then it retreated. The Imperial Guard had never retreated. In 20 years of Napoleonic warfare, the Guard's advance had been synonymous with French victory. When the soldiers on the battlefield saw the Guard retreating, the psychological effect was as catastrophic as the military reality. The cry went up that the Guard was retreating. The French army, which had been holding its positions under enormous pressure, collapsed. The retreat became a rout. Wellington's forces advanced down the slope. The Prussians pressed in from the east. French units that had maintained cohesion through a day of brutal fighting dissolved into individual men running for their lives. Napoleon was swept along in the retreat. He attempted to rally his forces, positioning himself at points along the retreating columns. But the panic was beyond recovery. Wellington and Blücher met near the inn called La Belle Alliance, which stood approximately at the position where Napoleon had begun the battle that morning. The meeting was brief and exhausted. Wellington reportedly said that the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Blücher, through his interpreter, said something rather less diplomatic about what should happen to Napoleon. Napoleon reached Paris on the 21st of June. He abdicated on the 22nd, for the second time, in favor of his son, a designation that had no practical effect since his son was in Vienna under Austrian custody and would never rule anything. He made his way to the Atlantic coast, hoping initially to reach the United States. The British naval blockade made an Atlantic crossing impossible. After waiting at Rochefort for several weeks while his options narrowed one by one, he wrote to the Prince Regent of Britain, invoking the example of Themistocles, the Athenian statesman who had thrown himself on the mercy of his enemies, and asking to be received in Britain as a private person. The British government declined. They had already decided where he was going, and they had chosen with the specific intention of making return impossible. The island of Saint Helena, in the South Atlantic, was approximately 1,800 kilometers from the nearest landmass. It was remote enough that escape was genuinely impossible without naval resources that Napoleon no longer possessed. He boarded the British ship HMS Northumberland on the 8th of August, 1815. On the ship, by multiple accounts, he was already talking, explaining, constructing the version of events he intended the world to remember. He had lost the military campaign. He understood, with the political intelligence that had never entirely left him, that one campaign remained. And in that final campaign, unlike the one that had just ended on the ridge south of Waterloo, he would not make the mistake of starting too late. Chapter 12. Saint Helena, Exile, Myth-Making, and the Second Conquest. There is a particular kind of intelligence that only reveals itself fully in defeat, not the intelligence of calculation and maneuver, which requires resources and freedom of action to express itself, but the intelligence of narrative, the ability to look at a situation that has gone completely wrong and understand that the story of what happened can still be shaped, that the meaning of a life is not fixed at the moment of its apparent ending, and that the most important audience for that story is not the people alive now, but the people who will come after. Napoleon understood this with a clarity that is, when you examine it carefully, more impressive than Austerlitz. He arrived at Saint Helena in October of 1815 and spent the next 6 years in conditions that were uncomfortable by any standard, and that he worked systematically to make appear as uncomfortable as possible. Not because he enjoyed discomfort, but because discomfort, documented and communicated to the outside world, was one of the instruments of the campaign he was running from exile. The island itself was not the torture chamber that Napoleon's accounts portrayed it as, nor the comfortable situation that his British custodians claimed to be providing. The reality was somewhere between those characterizations. The climate was damp and sometimes harsh. The house at Longwood, where he eventually settled, was inadequately maintained and prone to the particular misery of mold and leaking roofs. His custodian, the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, was a man of limited imagination and considerable anxiety about the responsibilities he had been given. He interpreted his instructions to prevent Napoleon's escape with a literalness that generated friction over questions like the radius within which Napoleon could walk unescorted and the correspondence he was permitted to conduct. The friction was real. Napoleon also understood that exaggerating it served his purposes, and he exaggerated it systematically and effectively. He had brought with him to Saint Helena a small court, the remnants of his imperial household, including the Comte de las Cases, who would become the primary instrument of the most consequential piece of writing produced during the exile. Las Cases was a French nobleman who spent approximately 18 months on Saint Helena before being expelled by Lowe for attempting to convey Napoleon's correspondence to recipients outside official channels. During those 18 months, he conducted extended conversations with Napoleon, recording them in detail, and eventually compiled those recordings into a work published in 1823, 2 years after Napoleon's death. The Memorial de Saint Helene ran to multiple volumes. It became one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. It shaped how an entire generation understood Napoleon, and through that generation, how subsequent generations understood him, because the memorial established the interpretive framework that other accounts were measured against. The Napoleon of the memorial is a specific and carefully constructed figure. He is the heir of the French Revolution, the man who consolidated and spread its genuine achievements across a continent, He is the champion of the European peoples against the oppressive monarchies that the coalition had restored. He is a man of peace who was forced into war by the implacable hostility of Britain. He is the victim of the mediocre men around him who failed to execute his plans, and of the coalition powers whose superior numbers rather than superior merit brought him down. Every element of this portrait contains some truth. The Napoleonic Code did genuinely consolidate revolutionary achievements. Napoleon did make genuine peace efforts at various points in his career. His military defeats were, in some cases, genuinely contributed to by the failures of subordinates. British hostility was genuine and consistent. What the memorial systematically excludes or minimizes is the complementary truth that makes the portrait honest rather than mythological. The wars that Napoleon claimed were forced upon him were also wars that he chose, escalated, and prolonged in ways that his own decisions at each stage could have avoided. The men he blamed for failures were men operating under his command, within systems he had designed. The coalition's hostility was, at least partly, a rational response to an empire that had demonstrated, repeatedly, that its expansion would continue as long as it could. Napoleon at Saint Helena was doing what he had done since Brienne. He was identifying the domain where he could win and concentrating his energy there with absolute focus. He could not win militarily. He could not win politically, but he could shape the story. He was assisted in this project by circumstances he had not created, but that served his purposes perfectly. The Bourbon Restoration that followed his defeat was, from a purely political management perspective, a sustained demonstration of how to generate nostalgia for what had preceded it. Louis XVIII and then Charles X governed France in ways that progressively alienated the constituencies that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods had created. The army officers who had served Napoleon found themselves passed over in favor of returning émigrés. The bourgeoisie that had prospered under Napoleonic stability found the restored monarchy threatening to the social settlements they had built. Against this background of Bourbon political incompetence, the memory of Napoleon operated as a standing rebuke. He had been decisive where they were hesitant. He had been meritocratic where they were aristocratic. He had made France powerful where they were making it small. Napoleon, from Saint Helena, fed this sentiment with extraordinary precision. He presented the Russian campaign not as the consequence of his own miscalculations, but as a campaign that was succeeding until winter intervened with a severity no commander could have anticipated. He presented Waterloo not as the consequence of his own decisions, but as the consequence of Grouchy's failure, Ney's errors, and the treachery of those who had welcomed his return and then failed to support it adequately. He presented himself as a man of the people, which was true in some of its dimensions and false in others. The version that survived in the memorial was the version that served the myth. He died on the 5th of May, 1821. The official cause was stomach cancer, the diagnosis that French and British medical opinion has generally supported. Though the matter has been complicated by the discovery of elevated arsenic levels in hair samples analyzed in the 20th century, toxicologists, including Pascal Kintz, who conducted rigorous analysis of surviving hair specimens, have found elevated arsenic present, but at levels that most specialists in the field consider consistent with widespread arsenic use in household products of the period, rather than deliberate poisoning. The scholarly consensus leans toward stomach cancer as the primary cause. While acknowledging that the arsenic question has not been definitively resolved to everyone's satisfaction, he was 51 years old. His body was returned to France in 1840, nearly 2 decades after his death, by the government of King Louis Philippe, who understood that the gesture would serve his own political purposes. The return of the remains became a national event of extraordinary emotional power. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of Paris as the funeral cortege passed. Among the crowd that day was an old man who had been a young sergeant in the Italian campaign. He had fought at Montenotte and Rivoli, had survived Spain, and come home to a farm in the Loire Valley, had watched his country change hands between empire and republic and monarchy, and back again with the weariness of someone who had outlived several versions of the world he was born into. He had not voted in the plebiscites. He had not attended the coronation. He had not cheered for the Bourbons. He stood in the winter cold and watched the cortege pass in silence. When his granddaughter asked him afterward why he had cried, he thought for a moment and said something that no one in his family quite understood at the time. He said he was the only one who knew what we were for. Whether that was a tribute or an indictment is the question that Napoleon's entire life forces open. The old sergeant meant it as a tribute. The families of the men who had marched into Russia and not come back might have heard it differently. Both of those things are true. They have always been true. They were true in Notre Dame in 1804 when Napoleon placed the crown on his own head. And they were true on the road in the Alps in 1796 when a tired soldier noticed that the new general rode differently than other generals. The project was complete. The man who had lost everything had arranged, from the far edge of the world, to be remembered on his own terms. Whether those terms were honest is the question that brings us to the final chapter. Chapter 13. The Legacy, what Napoleon actually left the world. Begin with a number, 3 to 6 million. That is the range of estimates. Compiled by historians including David Bell in his analysis of the Napoleonic War's human cost, and by the demographer Jacques Houday in his study of French population losses, for the total deaths attributable to the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815. The range reflects the genuine difficulty of counting deaths across multiple countries, multiple campaigns, and multiple causes that include combat, disease, starvation, and the civilian casualties of occupation and guerrilla warfare. 3 to 6 million people in a Europe whose total population was approximately 180 million. In approximately 12 years. Hold that number. Then hold another one. Dozens of countries, with some estimates placing the figure at more than 70 jurisdictions. That is the approximate count of nations whose legal systems are derived in whole or in significant part from the Napoleonic Code. As documented by legal historians, including John Merriman, in his comparative study of civil law systems, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, much of Latin America, and the state of Louisiana in the United States all operate within legal frameworks that trace their fundamental structure to the document Napoleon forced into existence between 1801 and 1804. These two numbers represent the most honest summary of Napoleon's legacy that any single formulation can provide. He left behind a legal system that genuinely improved the lives of hundreds of millions of people across 2 centuries. He also left behind a death toll that makes him, by the arithmetic of human destruction, one of the deadliest figures in European history before the 20th century. Both numbers are real. Neither cancels the other. The Napoleonic Code established, in legally enforceable form, a set of principles that the Enlightenment had articulated as ideals and that the Revolution had proclaimed as rights, but had failed to systematically implement. Equality before the law meant that the same rules applied to a duke and a peasant when they appeared before a judge. Not perfectly in practice, because practice is always imperfect. but as the foundational principle of the legal system, rather than as a slogan that the actual rules contradicted. Religious tolerance meant that a person's legal rights did not depend on their faith. Freedom of contract meant that individuals could enter binding agreements without requiring the permission of feudal superiors who no longer legally existed. These were structural changes to the relationship between the state and the individual that had taken centuries of philosophical argument to arrive at. Napoleon compressed that implementation into a legal document specific enough to be applied in a courtroom the day after it was published. The irony that a document establishing equality before the law was created by a man who governed without meaningful accountability is genuine and worth acknowledging. Napoleon was indifferent to it. He believed that the code's content was right regardless of the political system that had produced it. On that specific question, 2 centuries of legal history have substantially supported his position. The meritocratic principle that Napoleon embodied and institutionalized through the Legion of Honor, through the educational system, through the military promotion system that elevated soldiers based on demonstrated capability rather than family origin, left a mark on French and European social organization that outlasted his empire by generations. The Legion of Honor still exists. The lycée system still shapes French education. The prefectural administrative system still governs French regional administration, with modifications. But the legacy extends into places that the Memorial de Saint Helena never acknowledged and that honest accounting requires examining directly. The continental system inflicted severe economic damage on the populations of France and its allied and subject states. The enforcement of the system consumed resources and created enemies throughout the empire. When Napoleon fell, one of the first things the liberated populations of Europe did was resume trading with Britain. The conscription system that powered Napoleon's armies extracted young men from French and European communities at a rate and over a duration that had no precedent in European history. France under Napoleon mobilized approximately 2.5 million men for military service over the course of his wars. French demographic historians, including Hubris, have documented measurable effects on French population structure that persisted for decades after Waterloo. The communities that sent their young men into those armies and did not get them back paid a price that no accounting of the code's benefits fully offsets. And then there is Haiti. The French Revolution had abolished slavery in 1794, one of the most significant legal acts of the revolutionary period, with immediate effect in the French Caribbean colonies, most notably in Saint-Domingue, which is modern Haiti. Napoleon reinstated slavery in 1802, reversing one of the revolution's most progressive achievements in the interest of restoring the economic productivity of the Caribbean colonies. The Haitian Revolution, which had begun as a slave uprising in 1791 and had produced the only successful slave revolt in history, ended with Haitian independence in 1804 after a brutal military campaign that cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Napoleon's attempt to reimpose slavery on Saint-Domingue failed militarily. But the attempt itself, the decision to send an army to restore slavery in a country where enslaved people had fought and died for their freedom, represents a dimension of Napoleon's legacy that the heroic version of his story has consistently minimized, and that honest historical assessment requires placing alongside the Napoleonic Code with equal weight. The man who abolished feudal privilege in Europe attempted to restore chattel slavery in the Caribbean. Both things are true about the same person, made by the same hands, authorized by the same intelligence. This is what Napoleon's legacy ultimately forces us to confront, not the question of whether he was good or evil, which is too small for what he actually was, The question of what the full record of his life and his works tells us about the relationship between exceptional individual capacity and the structures through which that capacity operates, Napoleon demonstrated more clearly than almost any other figure in modern history what one human mind, operating at its highest capacity, can accomplish when given sufficient resources and sufficient freedom of action. He also demonstrated, with equal clarity, what that same mind costs when it operates without adequate accountability, without constraints that force even exceptional people to reckon honestly with the gap between their vision and reality. The achievements of his domestic administration were real precisely because they were implemented through institutions that survived him. The Napoleonic Code outlasted Napoleon because it was embedded in a legal system that operated independently of his personal authority. The educational institutions he created outlasted him. The administrative framework outlasted him. The wars he fought did not leave permanent achievements because they were expressions of his personal vision rather than of institutionalized policy. The Grand Empire collapsed with him because it was held together by his authority rather than by structures that could function in his absence. Power that is genuinely institutionalized, that operates through systems with meaningful accountability and constraints, is more durable and less dangerous than power concentrated in an individual, however exceptional that individual may be. Now stand back from the full arc of what we have examined across these 13 chapters. A boy from a conquered island who arrived at a French military school, speaking the wrong language and owning nothing of value except a mind that had already decided it would not accept the ceiling the world was trying to impose on it. The boy in the garden at Brienne, checking the angles of his snow fortification with the seriousness of someone who actually intended to defend it. The soldier Jean on the road in the Alps, noticing that the new general rode differently, thought differently, moved faster, and carrying that observation all the way to Russia, where it cost him everything. The clerk, Pierre, in St. Cloud, watching the forms of Republican government being maintained with meticulous attention, even as its substance was being dismantled in the rooms around him. The old sergeant in the winter crowd of 1840, crying for a man who was the only one who knew what we were for. These are the people through whose eyes Napoleon's story actually lived, not in the gold and granite of Les Invalides, in the worn boots on the road in the Alps, in the letter Jean sent home to Leon that his family found difficult to believe. In the 2 days, Napoleon did not come out of his rooms when he heard that Josephine was gone. The spying question we began with was, how does the same man who liberated nations end up destroying them? The answer is that he did not become two different people. He was always the same person. The liberating and the destroying came from the same source. The absolute refusal to accept limits that allowed him to cross the Alps and remake a legal system and rebuild an army in 6 months after Russia was the same refusal that drove him into Spain when political wisdom said stop, into Russia when logistical reality said stop, back from Elba when every rational calculation said stop. He could not stop, not because he lacked intelligence. He had more intelligence than almost anyone in the room. He could not stop because stopping required accepting a limit, and accepting limits was the one thing he had been refusing to do since a French boy at Brienne first told him he did not belong there. He proved that boy wrong about Brienne. He proved everyone wrong about what was possible for a Corsican outsider in revolutionary France. And in proving them wrong, in demonstrating again and again that the limits others imposed were not the actual limits, he developed a relationship with limits in general that ultimately could not distinguish between the limits that deserved to be broken and the limits that existed for reasons that transcended his individual judgment. That is not a uniquely Napoleonic failure. It is a human failure, made visible at continental scale by a man whose capacities were large enough to make the consequences continental. He is buried in Paris, in a tomb of red granite beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, in a space so deliberately overwhelming that visitors instinctively approach it in silence. The silence is the right response, not as reverence for a hero, not as condemnation of a tyrant, but as the appropriate response to something genuinely unresolved, something that 2 centuries of argument have not simplified, and that another 2 centuries probably will not simplify either. The old sergeant understood something true about Napoleon. The families of the men who marched into Russia understood something equally true. The Haitian people who fought and died to prevent the reimposition of slavery understood something true that neither the sergeant nor the families were positioned to see from where they stood. All of those truths are real. None of them is the whole story. He wanted to be remembered. He arranged it with characteristic thoroughness. The exile is over. The question is not